Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the Deep Dives. Today, well, we're tackling a giant, a figure whose shadow, you could say, stretches right across the 20th century, Sir Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill.
It's quite the undertaking. I mean, his political life alone spanned, what, 62 years? Just astonishing. 2 terms as prime minister, countless cabinet roles, military service. And he somehow found time to be this incredibly prolific writer, won a Nobel Prize for it even.
Yeah, the source stack for this one is substantial. So our mission today really isn't just to walk through his life year by year.
No, that would take weeks.
Exactly. It's more about distilling this huge, complex life down to its core themes. We want to spotlight those unexpected moments, those pivots like, switching parties not once, but effectively twice.
And the contradictions, too, the ideas that drove him.
Right. So for you, the learner, this is hope for the shortcut, getting under the skin of the man, not just the myth.
And what's really fascinating when you dig into the sources is how Churchill's career seems driven by these 2 often opposing forces. On one hand, he's a deep believer in classical economic liberalism, especially free trade, like fundamentally.
Okay.
But on the other hand, he's this absolutely staunch, unwavering imperialist, believer in the British Empire through and through.
So those 2 things, liberalism and imperialism, sometimes they pull in the same direction, sometimes not so much.
Precisely. And we'll see how that tension plays out, how it pushes him across party lines, fuels his greatest triumphs, and arguably leads to some of his biggest missteps as well. It's quite the ideological tightrope he walked.
So let's start at the beginning. Blenheim Palace, 1874. Born right into the heart of the aristocracy, the Spencer family, direct descendant of the first Duke of Marlborough, the famous general.
Absolutely. Lineage mattered. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a big name in conservative politics himself. And his mother, Jenny Jerome, the American socialite, well, she was a force of nature in her own right. Connections everywhere.
So, born with a silver spoon, you might say. But the early school years, they weren't exactly covered in glory, were they?
Not at all. The sources are pretty clear. He really struggled academically. Places like St. George's, Harrow, he just didn't thrive in that structured environment. And his father, Lord Randolph, basically saw the writing on the wall. Academics weren't his son's forte, so the military seemed the next logical step, maybe the only step in his father's eyes.
So he gets pushed toward Sandhurst, the Royal Military College.
Right, but even that wasn't easy. It took him 3 attempts to get into the cavalry branch, finally making it in 1893. You get this sense early on of someone who has to constantly strive, constantly overcome these perceived shortcomings. It definitely built a powerful drive and ambition.
And that ambition, it seems, didn't point towards a quiet life in the barracks. As soon as he's commissioned in the 4th Queen's Own Hussars, he's looking for action. And crucially, looking to write about it.
Yeah, this is a really key moment, kind of an aha moment for him. He figures out pretty quickly that the path to influence, maybe even political power, isn't just about being a soldier. It's about being seen, being a soldier, and writing about it.
Using journalism to build his profile. And maybe pay the bills.
Exactly. He leveraged his mother's connections, quite ruthlessly actually, to get himself posted where the action was, conflict zones. He wangled his way to Cuba to observe their War of Independence, sending back reports for the Daily Graphic.
So even then, the writer and the soldier were intertwined.
Absolutely. Then it was off to British India Bangalore, the northwest frontier, which was pretty volatile. Then later Sudan for a modest war. He wasn't just passively serving, he was actively seeking out experience he could turn into copy.
And while he was in India, in Bangalore specifically, wasn't that when he really buckled down with self-education?
Yes, that's right. Around the late 1890s, he felt, intellectually behind his peers who'd gone through university. So he sets himself this incredibly rigorous reading program.
Like what? What was he reading?
Oh, the classics. Plato, Darwin, Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Macaulay's Histories. Heavy stuff. He was consciously trying to build that intellectual foundation he felt he lacked.
And feeding that directly into his writing, presumably.
Immediately. His first book, The Story of the Malakand Field Force, comes out of his experiences in India. It launches his writing career. But the writing wasn't just for ambition or money. It was deeper than that.
You mean the black dog?
Exactly. He suffered from recurring bouts of severe depression, what he famously called his black dog, and writing that intense creative effort was his primary way of keeping it at bay. It was a psychological necessity as much as a career move.
Fascinating. So his active military service kind of culminates in the Sudan campaign.
Yeah, he participated in one of the very last major cavalry charges of the British Army at the Battle of Omdurman in 1898. Very dramatic stuff.
But then he doesn't just bask in the glory, does he? He actually criticizes his own commander.
Right, which is quite telling. He resigns from the army not long after Omdurman, and he publicly criticizes General Kitchener, the commander, for the harsh treatment of wounded enemy fighters, and very controversially, for desecrating the tomb of the Mahdi, Muhammad Ahmad.
That takes some guts for a young officer.
It does. It shows this willingness, even early on, to speak out based on principle, even if it ruffled feathers. Maybe even because it ruffled feathers. It certainly got him noticed.
And that leads him straight into politics. His first attempt, though, not a success.
No, his first run for parliament was as a conservative in Oldham, a by-election in 1899. He lost, but only narrowly. He campaigned as a conservative and a Tory Democrat, trying to blend traditionalism with some reformist ideas.
But then fate, or rather war, intervenes again. The Second Boer War breaks out.
Perfect timing for him, in a strange way. He heads straight to South Africa, not as a soldier this time, but as a war correspondent for the Morning Post. Hugely lucrative contract, by the way.
And this is where the story becomes legendary. The train ambush, the capture.
Yes, the whole POW camp episode in Pretoria. It's almost unbelievable. His train gets ambushed by the Boers, he's captured, imprisoned.
But he doesn't stay long.
Not Winston. The escape, it reads like something out of a novel. Scaling the wall, hiding out, hopping freight trains, hiding in a coal mine for days, finally making his way hundreds of miles across enemy territory to Portuguese East Africa and freedom.
And the publicity back home must have been immense.
Off the charts. Instant national hero. This daring young aristocrat giving the Boers the slip. It was exactly the kind of story the public craved. He was made.
And he knew exactly how to leverage that fame.
Oh, absolutely. He comes back, briefly rejoins the army for a bit of mopping up. There's this rather theatrical incident where he and his cousin demand the surrender of 52 Boer prison guards.
Just the two of them.
Well, they had backup eventually, but yeah, initially. Then he immediately converts his fame and his war dispatches into cash via a hugely successful lecture tour. Britain, America. He even met Mark Twain and President McKinley. Didn't hit it off with Theodore Roosevelt, apparently.
Two strong personalities there.
You can imagine. But the money from the lectures and the writing, that's what bankrolled his next political campaign.
And this time, Oldham works out.
It does. October 1900, he's elected Conservative MP for Oldham. He's just 25 years old. And it's crucial to remember, he funded this himself. Not family money, primarily, but earnings from his pen and his adventures. Quite remarkable, really.
Okay, so he arrives in Parliament in 1901, a young conservative hero. But this is where things get really interesting ideologically. He doesn't stay conservative for long, does he?
No, barely 4 years. He takes his seat, and almost immediately you see him starting to, well, drift. He starts criticizing his own party spending, particularly on the military, which is ironic given his background.
And he starts hanging out with liberals.
Yes, particularly the liberal imperialists, figures who believed in the empire, but also in progressive policies at home. He felt more aligned with them intellectually on certain key issues.
And the big breaking point, the thing that actually makes him cross the floor in 1904.
Yeah.
It's about trade.
It's fundamentally about protectionism. This is absolutely key to understanding Churchill's first big political shift. The Conservative Party, under the influence of Joseph Chamberlain, starts pushing for taxes on imported goods to protect British industries.
And Churchill's having none of it.
Absolutely none. For Churchill, free trade wasn't just an economic policy. It was like the lifeblood of the British Empire. He believed it kept the empire connected, prosperous, and benefited ordinary people by keeping food prices low.
So tariffs were anti-empire, in his view.
Exactly. He saw protectionism as economically damaging and crucially bad for the empire's unity. So he co-founds this group called the Free Food League to campaign against tariffs. And then, very dramatically, in May 1904, he walks across the floor of the House of Commons and sits with the Liberals. A huge political gamble.
And it wasn't just economics, right? The sources mention he opposed the Aliens Bill around the same time.
That's right, the 1905 Aliens Bill, which was aimed primarily at restricting Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe. Churchill spoke out quite strongly against it, arguing for Britain's old, tolerant, and generous practice of free entry and asylum. It shows his liberalism wasn't purely economic. There was a social dimension, too, at least early on.
So he quickly makes a name for himself as a sort of radical liberal.
Yeah, he aligns himself with figures like John Morley and, significantly, David Lloyd George, who would become his great partner in social reform.
His first government role with the Liberals is Undersecretary for the Colonies in 1905. Back dealing with the Empire.
Right back into it. He's involved in drafting the constitution for the Transvaal, post-Boer War South Africa, trying to create some kind of workable relationship between the British and the Boers.
And the sources mention his reaction to the Bambatha Rebellion.
Yes, a Zulu uprising in Natal. Churchill privately expressed his horror at what he called the disgusting butchery of the natives by the colonial forces. It shows an early, perhaps paternalistic, but nonetheless present concern about the excesses of colonial rule.
Then he gets his big promotion into the cabinet as president of the Board of Trade in 1908, youngest cabinet member in decades.
Yeah, since 1866, I think. And this is where he really makes his mark as a social reformer, working very closely with Lloyd George. Their goal, quite explicitly, was to create a network of state intervention and regulation, looking at models like Bismarck's Germany.
So what kind of specific reforms are we talking about here?
Foundational stuff, really. Things we take for granted now. The Mines 8 Hours Bill, limiting how long miners could work underground. The Trade Boards Bill, which was huge. It established minimum wages in certain industries, the so-called sweated trades, and regulated things like meal breaks.
Setting a precedent for state intervention in wages.
Absolutely. Then there was the Labor Exchange Bill, basically creating job centers to help the unemployed find work. And arguably the biggest one, the National Insurance Act of 1911, which he drafted with Lloyd George. This laid the groundwork for state-provided sickness and unemployment benefits.
It's quite a record for someone often remembered just for war.
It really is. He was, in this period, genuinely driving progressive social change. A paternalist? Sure, he wasn't a socialist by any stretch, but he believed the state had a duty to provide a basic safety net.
His next big job is Home Secretary, 1910, 1911. Does the reforming continue?
It does, particularly in the prison system. He pushes for reforms like setting up prison libraries, easing rules on solitary confinement. He made a point of distinguishing between political prisoners, like suffragettes, and common criminals. And he was quite active in reviewing death sentences, commuting a significant number, 21 out of 43, I believe.
But this period also brings some major controversies that stick with him. Tota Pandy, for instance.
Yes, the Tony Pandy riots in South Wales, 1910, striking coal miners clashed with police. Churchill, as Home Secretary, authorized sending in Metropolitan Police from London, crucially, without firearms rather than deploying the army immediately.
Which he argued was actually a de-escalation.
That was his defense, yes. That sending police was less provocative than sending soldiers. But for the miners and the burgeoning labor movement, it looked like the state, personified by this aristocratic Home Secretary, coming down hard on striking workers. It created this lasting image of him as being anti-labor, which haunted him for years.
Even though he was pushing through pro-worker legislation elsewhere.
The irony is profound, isn't it? And then there's the almost theatrical siege of Sydney Street in 1911.
Right, where he actually shows up at the scene.
He does. These Latvian anarchists, armed burglars, are cornered in a house in London's East End. There's a gunfight, the house catches fire, Churchill arrives, gets photographed seemingly directing operations, and he makes this controversial call to let the house burn down rather than risk police lives trying to save the men inside.
The press must have had a field day.
Oh, absolutely. The image of the Home Secretary at an active siege, it was sensational. Added to this perception of him being perhaps a bit too involved, a bit too dramatic.
But then the global situation shifts things dramatically.
Yeah.
The Agadir crisis in 1911.
Yes, a naval standoff between Germany and France over Morocco. It really ramps up tensions and focuses minds in London on the German naval threat. For Churchill, it seems to have been a wake-up call. His focus pivots almost overnight, from domestic reform to naval preparedness.
And that leads directly to his appointment as First Lord of the Admiralty later that year.
Exactly. October 1911, he throws himself into the role with characteristic energy. His main goal, ensure the Royal Navy is ready for a potential war with Germany.
How does he go about that?
He pushes for a massive shipbuilding program, famously vowing to build 2 British dreadnoughts for every one the Germans laid down. He establishes a proper naval war staff to improve strategic planning. He boosts sailors' pay. And, crucially, he champions naval aviation.
The air arm. That seems quite forward-thinking for
It
1911.
really was. He basically creates the Royal Naval Air Service from scratch. He learned to fly himself briefly. He even supposedly coined the word seaplane. He ordered 100 aircraft, recognizing the potential of air power in naval warfare early on.
And then there's the oil decision. That seems strategically vital.
Hugely important. Churchill realized the Navy's future was oil-powered ships, not coal. But Britain had no secure oil supplies. So in June 1914, just before the war, he persuades the government to do something unprecedented. Buy a majority stake, 51%, in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company.
The government taking control of a private company for strategic reasons.
Precisely. It was a massive move, ensuring the Royal Navy had access to vital Persian Gulf oil for decades to come, arguably one of his most far-sighted decisions.
He also supported Irish Home Rule during this time, but opposed partition.
Yes, he supported the Liberal government's push for home rule for Ireland, but he was against splitting off Ulster, famously saying, "Half a province cannot impose a permanent veto on the nation." Another complex balancing act.
So war breaks out in August 1914. He's overseeing the Navy's initial actions, the blockade of Germany.
And interestingly, he uses Admiralty funds, kind of off the books initially, to support the development of a secret weapon, the Armored Tracked Vehicle Project, which eventually becomes the tank. He saw its potential early.
But despite all this energy and foresight, his time at the Admiralty ends in disaster. Gallipoli.
Yes, the Dardanelles campaign of 1915. It was Churchill's brainchild, really. The idea was to force the Dardanelles Strait with naval power, knock Ottoman Turkey out of the war, open a supply route to Russia, and bypass the stalemate on the Western Front.
A bold strategic gamble.
It's extremely bold, but the naval attack failed disastrously. It was repulsed with heavy losses, and that led to the equally disastrous Gallipoli land campaign, trying to achieve by land what the Navy couldn't. Huge casualties, total failure.
And Churchill got the blame.
He became the scapegoat. The conservatives, who joined the coalition government formed in May 1915, distrusted his judgment after Gallipoli and demanded his removal from the Admiralty.
So he's demoted.
Demoted to a powerless sinecure, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, utterly humiliating for him. By November 1915, he resigns from the government altogether. His meteoric rise is suddenly, brutally halted. Gallipoli becomes this albatross around his neck for years.
So, out of government, disgraced over Gallipoli. What does Churchill do? He doesn't just fade away, does he?
No, that wasn't his style. He does something quite remarkable, really. He rejoins the army and arranges to serve on the Western Front.
Really? Back to active duty.
Yes. He gets command of a battalion, the 6th Royal Scots Fusiliers, as a lieutenant colonel in early 1916. And this wasn't some token posting miles from the fighting. He was in the trenches, sharing the risks with his men. He had several close calls, nearly killed by shrapnel.
That must have gone some way to restoring his reputation. Showing personal courage.
It certainly helped. It showed he wasn't just a politician playing at soldiers. He was willing to put his life on the line. And it allowed him to return to politics, albeit gradually. Lloyd George brought him back into government in 1917.
As Minister of Munitions.
Right, a critical role overseeing war production. He was apparently very effective, boosting output significantly. He also wasn't afraid to be tough. Famously ended a munitions workers' strike by threatening to conscript the strikers into the army.
After the war ends, he becomes Secretary of State for War and Air in 1919. Big job, overseeing demobilization.
Yes, and it's here that his strong anti-communist views really come to the fore. He's dealing with the aftermath of the Russian Revolution.
And he's wary of punishing Germany too harshly.
He is, which might seem surprising. But his reasoning was strategic. He argued that a completely broken Germany might leave a vacuum, or worse, fall to Bolshevism itself. He saw Germany, even a defeated Germany, as a potential future bulwark against Soviet Russia.
The famous cordon sanitaire idea.
Exactly. That phrase comes from this period. His idea was to create this barrier, this quarantine line, of independent states around Soviet Russia to contain the spread of communism westward. His anti-Bolshevism was visceral, intense, and it shaped his foreign policy thinking for decades.
He's also heavily involved in reshaping the post-war world, particularly in Ireland and the Middle East.
Yes, as colonial secretary from 1921, he plays a key role in negotiating the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which creates the Irish Free State, a very complex and controversial process.
And the Middle East.
Yeah.
Creating new countries out of the old Ottoman Empire.
Right. He was central to the Cairo Conference in 1921, which essentially drew many of the modern borders. He was involved in installing King Faisal in Iraq and Abdullah in Transjordan, basically creating kingdoms to manage British interests.
And his views on Zionism.
He remained supportive. Consistent with his earlier stance, he supported the idea of a Jewish national home in Palestine and, as colonial secretary, refused petitions from Palestinian Arabs asking to prohibit Jewish immigration.
But then his political fortunes take another nosedive. 1922.
A real crash this time. The Lloyd George coalition government collapses, partly over foreign policy crises like Chenak, there's a general election, and Churchill, who's actually in hospital having his appendix removed during the campaign.
Bad timing.
Terrible timing. He loses his seat in Dundee to, of all people, a prohibitionist candidate who campaigned on an anti-alcohol platform.
Ouch. So he finds himself completely out.
Completely. He famously described his situation with bleak humor. In the twinkling of an eye, I found myself without an office, without a seat, without a party, and without an appendix. A real low point.
So, now, back to writing.
Back to writing. It's his refuge, his income, and his way of battling the black dog again. He starts publishing his monumental history of the First World War, the world crisis. Hugely successful, critically and commercially.
And he starts plotting his political comeback. But not necessarily with the liberals.
No, he feels the Liberal Party is declining. He starts moving back towards the Conservatives. He runs in 1924 for the Epping seat, initially as a constitutionalist, kind of bridging the gap and wins. A year later, he formally rejoins the Conservative Party. The prodigal son returns.
And astonishingly, the Conservative Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, immediately makes him Chancellor of the Exchequer.
It's one of the most surprising appointments in modern British history. Churchill had zero financial background. He'd spent years attacking conservative economic policy. Baldwin apparently said he did it to neutralize Churchill, better to have him inside the tent causing trouble than outside.
So how did Chancellor Churchill do? The sources seem critical.
Deeply critical. His tenure as Chancellor, 1924-1929, is dominated by one hugely controversial and many argue disastrous decision, returning Britain to the gold standard in 1925.
Okay, explain the gold standard issue. Why was it so bad?
Well, Britain had left the gold standard during the war. Returning meant fixing the value of the pound sterling to a specific amount of gold. The problem was the rate Churchill chose the pre-war parity of $4.86 to the pound.
And that rate was too high.
Way too high by 1925. The pound was effectively overvalued by about 10%, the immediate consequence. British exports instantly became 10% more expensive for foreign buyers.
Crippling for industries that rely on exports.
Absolutely devastating, especially for the coal industry, which was already struggling. It led to demands for wage cuts, massive industrial strife, and directly contributed to the conditions that caused the 1926 general strike.
And Keynes warned him against it.
John Maynard Keynes wrote a famous pamphlet, The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill, savaging the decision. He argued it would cause deflation, unemployment, and industrial unrest. And he was right. It's seen as a major policy blunder that significantly hampered the British economy in the late 1920s.
And during the general strike itself, Churchill took a very hard line.
Extremely hard line. He edited the government's strike-breaking newspaper, the British Gazette, which was very provocative and propagandistic. Although, interestingly, after the strike, he did argue for introducing a legally binding minimum wage, showing that complex mix of attitudes again.
But the damage with the labor movement was done.
Oh, yes. The perception from Tony Pandy, reinforced by the general strike and the gold standard's impact on workers, it cemented his image in many working-class communities as an enemy for a very long time.
The Conservatives lose the 1929 election, and Churchill enters what become known as his wilderness years.
10 long years out of government office. From 1929 right up to the outbreak of war in 1939. He's on the backbenches, increasingly isolated even within his own party.
What occupies him during this decade? More writing.
A huge amount of writing. Again, it's his income and his therapy. He writes the massive biography of his ancestor, Marlborough, his life and times. He writes his autobiography, My Early Life. He writes countless articles. He has to earn a living.
And politically, he takes a stand that isolates him further. On India.
Yes, the India question. The big debate in the early 1930s was about granting India Dominion status, a step towards self-government within the empire. Churchill fiercely opposed this.
Why? Back to his imperialism.
Absolutely. He saw it as the first step towards dismantling the British Empire, which he believed in passionately, almost mystically. He resigned from the conservative shadow cabinet in 1931 over this issue. His rhetoric was incredibly strong, famously calling Gandhi a seditious Middle Temple lawyer now posing as a fakir.
Wow, that's quite something.
It alienated a lot of people, even within his own party. He seemed like a man out of time, clinging to an imperial past.
But this isolation, this position on the fringes, it paradoxically gives him a unique platform for his other great cause of the 1930s.
Precisely. His warnings about Nazi Germany. Because he wasn't bound by government responsibility or cabinet loyalty, he could speak his mind freely and loudly.
And he starts warning about German rearmament very early.
From 1933 onwards, as soon as Hitler comes to power, he becomes the leading voice advocating for British rearmament, especially air power. He had sources, possibly clandestine, feeding him information about the buildup of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force.
And he's using this information in Parliament.
Constantly. Warning against complacency, arguing against cuts to Britain's Air Force budget. He denounced the nature of the Nazi regime itself, its cruelty and intolerance. He saw the danger clearly when many others preferred not to.
He was famously critical of Chamberlain's appeasement policy.
Vehemently so. He saw the Munich Agreement in 1938, where Chamberlain gave Hitler parts of Czechoslovakia as a total disaster. He called it a total and unmitigated defeat. His prescription wasn't negotiation, it was deterrence, the accumulation of deterrence against the aggressor. Build up strength to prevent war, or be ready to fight it.
He also got involved in the abdication crisis in 1936.
Yes, he supported King Edward VIII's desire to marry Wallis Simpson, which put him at odds with Baldwin and the establishment view. It was another instance of him seeming out of step, perhaps overly loyal or romantic. He later felt the abdication was rushed and unnecessary. So the wilderness years, politically frustrating, personally difficult with the black dog, but ultimately they positioned him perfectly. When war finally came, the man who had been warning about it for years was the obvious choice to lead the fight. The outsider became indispensable.
So, September 1939, Britain declares war on Germany. And almost immediately, Churchill is back.
Instantly, the call goes out. He's reappointed First Lord of the Admiralty, the same post he held at the start of World War I. There's that famous signal sent to the fleet, Winston is back, a huge morale boost right away.
And even during the phony war, that quiet initial period, he starts rebuilding his reputation.
Yeah, things start happening at sea. The Battle of the River Plate, where British cruisers corner and effectively force the scuttling of the German pocket battleship Graf Spee. It's a big early victory. Then the Altmark incident in February 1940, where a Royal Navy destroyer boards a German supply ship in neutral Norwegian waters to rescue hundreds of British prisoners.
That was controversial, but seen as decisive.
Very much so. It contrasted sharply with the perceived inaction elsewhere. Churchill seemed like the only one actually doing things. He was projecting dynamism.
And then the disaster of the Norway campaign in spring 1940 changes everything.
Completely. The failed Allied attempt to counter the German invasion of Norway leads to the crucial Norway debate in Parliament in May 1940. Chamberlain's government is savaged. His majority collapses.
Yeah, and he has to go. But Churchill isn't the obvious successor initially. Lord Halifax is considered.
Halifax was the foreign secretary, widely respected, favored by the king and many conservatives. But there were two problems. One, Halifax was reluctant. Two, and crucially, he was in the House of Lords.
Which makes leading a wartime government difficult.
Very difficult. You need the Prime Minister in the House of Commons answering questions, leading debates. Also, the Labour Party, whose support was essential for a national unity government, made it clear they would serve under Churchill, but probably not under Halifax.
But Churchill gets the call from the king on May 10th, 1940, the very day Hitler launches his invasion of France and the Low Countries.
Incredible timing. He forms his national government, bringing in Labour and Liberal leaders, and he immediately creates this new, powerful position for himself, Minister of Defense, alongside being Prime Minister.
Giving him direct control over the military strategy.
Total control. He wanted his hands on the levers of the entire war machine. He famously wrote later that he felt his whole life had been a preparation for this moment, for this hour, and for this trial.
And almost immediately, his words become as important as weapons, his speeches.
Absolutely crucial. France is collapsing. Britain faces invasion. Morale is everything. And Churchill, despite that slight lisp, the difficulty with sounds which he somehow weaponized, making Nazi sound even more contemptuous as Nazi, he finds the words the nation needs to hear.
The blood, toil, tears, and sweat speech. his first as PM.
Setting the tone, no false promises, just grim determination.
But behind the scenes, there's a moment of real crisis in the War Cabinet, isn't there? Late May 1940.
Yes, the War Cabinet crisis. As the British Army is being pushed back to Dunkirk, Lord Halifax raises the possibility of exploring peace terms, perhaps through Mussolini acting as an intermediary with Hitler.
Seriously considering negotiation.
Halifax felt it was responsible to at least find out what terms might be on offer before Britain was potentially destroyed. But Churchill was adamantly opposed. He feared it would be a slippery slope to surrender.
How did he win that argument?
He masterfully rallied support, particularly from the labor ministers, Attlee and Greenwood. He argued passionately that Britain must fight on alone if necessary. He basically outmaneuvered Halifax and secured the cabinet's unanimous backing to continue the war no matter what, a pivotal moment.
And that resolve is then broadcast to the world. Dunkirk happens.
Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of over 330,000 Allied soldiers from the beaches. Churchill calls it a miracle of deliverance, but warns Parliament wars are not won by evacuations.
And then comes the "We shall fight on the beaches" speech.
June 4th, 1940, an incredible piece of oratory. Defiance, determination, but also a clear signal to the United States that Britain needed help. Followed shortly after by the "This was their finest hour" speech as the Battle of Britain looms.
He's not just talking, though. He's acting, setting up new organizations.
Yes, he authorizes the creation of the Special Operations Executive, SOE, with the explicit, ruthless mission to set Europe ablaze, supporting resistance movements, sabotage, espionage behind enemy lines. And he creates the Commandos, specialized raiding forces, very unconventional warfare.
And during the Battle of Britain itself, that summer in autumn of 1940, he coins another immortal phrase for the RAF pilots.
Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Perfect encapsulation of the sacrifice and the stakes.
Strategically, his absolute top priority becomes securing American aid, right?
Absolutely critical. Britain couldn't win alone. He cultivates this incredibly close personal relationship with President Roosevelt. First comes the Destroyers for Bases deal in September 1940. Britain gets 50 old U.S. destroyers, desperately needed for convoy protection, in exchange for giving the U.S. long leases on British bases in the Atlantic and Caribbean.
A smart trade, though maybe unequal.
Pragmatic. Churchill knew he needed those ships now. Then comes the real game changer. Lend-Lease, formally enacted in March 1941. The U.S. would supply Britain with arms, food, raw materials, essentially on credit, with repayment deferred until after the war.
How was repayment defined?
That was the genius. It wasn't just about money. The U.S. accepted that Britain's defense was America's defense. So repayment could be in kind, through things like intelligence sharing and, ultimately, just by Britain surviving and fighting. It was Roosevelt's way of helping Britain short of actually entering the war.
Then Hitler makes a strategic blunder, invading the Soviet Union in June 1941, Operation Barbarossa.
And Churchill, the arch anti-communist, doesn't hesitate for a second. He immediately pledges British support to Stalin. That's when he makes that famous quip. If Hitler invaded hell, I would at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
For now, absolutely. Defeating Hitler trumped everything. This leads to the first meeting with Roosevelt off the coast of Newfoundland in August 1941, where they agree the Atlantic Charter,
which outlines post-war aims.
Yes, principles like self-determination, free trade, freedom of the seas, disarmament. It's essentially the foundation stone for the United Nations, a statement of shared values against Nazi tyranny.
Then Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. The U.S. is in the war.
Churchill reportedly slept soundly for the first time in years. He immediately travels to Washington for the Arcadia Conference. Crucially, they agree on the Europe First strategy. Prioritize defeating Hitler before focusing fully on Japan.
And the first joint military operation is decided.
Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, planned for late 1942. Churchill also agrees to appoint an American, Dwight D. Eisenhower, as the supreme commander for the eventual invasion of Europe. Building that alliance was paramount.
But the middle war years bring setbacks and personal challenges for Churchill, too. His health.
Yes. He suffers a heart attack while in Washington in late 41 or early 42, then pneumonia later. He's working at an incredible pace under immense stress, and he's not young. The doctors order rest, but he largely ignores them. He insists on traveling, making speeches, like the famous "some chicken, some neck" speech to the Canadian Parliament after his recovery.
And militarily, 1942 is a rough year initially.
Very rough. The fall of Singapore to the Japanese in February 1942 is a devastating blow to British prestige and morale. Churchill calls it the worst disaster in British military history. Then the German battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau make their audacious Channel dash right under the noses of the RAF and Royal Navy. His morale apparently hit rock bottom.
But things start to turn later that year.
Yes, the autumn of 1942 is pivotal. Montgomery's victory at El Alamein in North Africa, and the Soviets holding firm at Stalingrad. That's when Churchill delivers that other famous line. Now, this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. Cautious optimism.
And he pushes hard for the Mediterranean strategy, invading Italy.
He did. He argued strongly to Roosevelt that after clearing North Africa, the next logical step was Sicily, then Italy, the soft underbelly of Axis Europe, as he famously put it. The Americans were more focused on a direct cross-channel invasion, but Churchill persuaded them.
Though Italy turned out to be anything but soft.
No, the Italian campaign became a long, hard slog. Churchill himself later acknowledged the difficulties, referring to the stalled Anzio beachhead as being like a stranded whale.
The relationship with Stalin and Roosevelt deepens with the big conferences. Tehran in 1943.
Yes, the first meeting of the big three leaders. Key decisions are made. Agreement that Germany must be forced into unconditional surrender and would be divided into occupation zones. And crucially, Roosevelt and Stalin really pressed Churchill to commit firmly to a date for Operation Overlords, the invasion of France, for 1944.
Churchill was still hesitant about overlords.
He still favored peripheral operations, hitting Germany from the edges, but he was essentially outvoted. The Americans and Soviets insisted on the second front in France.
This period also sees the terrible Bengal famine in 1943. What was Churchill's government's role, or lack of role, there?
It's deeply controversial. Millions died. The causes were complex. Japanese occupation of Burma cut off rice supplies, there were crop failures, natural disasters, and poor local administration. But Churchill's government in London is heavily criticized for its slow response.
Why the delay in sending aid?
The official reason given was a critical shortage of shipping due to the war in the Atlantic and elsewhere. Every ship was needed for the war effort. Requests for large amounts of grain relief were initially refused on those grounds.
But aid was eventually sent.
Yes, eventually Churchill did order grain shipments, but critics argue it was too little, too late. The controversy was massively inflamed by reports of derogatory comments Churchill allegedly made privately about Indians, suggesting they were somehow responsible for the famine by breeding like rabbits. Whether he said exactly that is debated, but it reflected a callous attitude that damaged his reputation severely, especially in India.
Moving towards the endgame. D-Day, June 6, 1944. Churchill's heavily involved in planning overlords.
Absolutely thrown himself into it by this point, despite his earlier reservations. He wanted to personally witness the landing, sail with the fleet, but King George VI apparently forbade him from taking the risk.
Then the Yalta Conference, February 1945. Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin meeting again as victory seems near.
Yalta makes progress on the structure of the United Nations, but it's deeply controversial for the agreements reached about post-war Poland, which essentially conceded dominant Soviet influence there. Churchill faced a lot of criticism back home for selling out Poland.
Yalta also had consequences for displaced people. Operation Keelhaul.
Yes, this was a secret agreement made at Yalta, though implemented afterwards. It involved the forced repatriation of millions of Soviet citizens who were in Allied-occupied zones back to the Soviet Union, regardless of their wishes. This included prisoners of war, forced laborers, but also anti-communist Russians and people from Eastern European nations annexed by the USSR.
And they faced persecution back home.
Many faced execution or imprisonment in the gulags. It was a brutal act of political expediency, done to appease Stalin and maintain the alliance in the final phase of the war against Japan. It remains a very dark chapter.
And the bombing campaign against Germany? Dresden.
The firebombing of Dresden in February 1945 caused immense civilian casualties, estimates vary wildly, but certainly tens of thousands. Coming so late in the war, its military value was questioned. Afterwards, Churchill himself seemed to have second thoughts. He wrote a memo questioning the strategy of area bombing purely for terror and wanton destruction, and urged focusing back on specific military and industrial targets.
VE Day finally arrives, May 8, 1945. Churchill broadcast to the nation.
Moment of supreme triumph. But even then, there's that anecdote about him on the balcony at Buckingham Palace. He insists that Ernest Bevin, the labor minister who'd served loyally in the war cabinet, share the applause. Bevin supposedly replies, "No, Winston, this is your day." a sign of the respect he commanded, even across party lines at that moment.
But that unity dissolves almost instantly. The coalition ends. Churchill leads a caretaker government into a general election.
And he seems out of touch with the public mood. His performance at the Potsdam Conference with Truman and Stalin just before the election result was apparently poor. Eden described him as unfocused, easily manipulated by Stalin.
And the election campaign itself?
A disaster for him. He misjudged the public desire for post-war change, for social reform. People wanted the implementation of the Beveridge Report, the blueprint for the welfare state, including the National Health Service. Labor promised that. Churchill seemed focused on past glories and future imperial concerns.
And he made that famous gaffe about labor needing a Gestapo.
Yes, suggesting labor would need secret police to implement their socialist policies. It backfired badly, seemed absurd and offensive after a war fought against the Gestapo.
Yeah.
The result, in July 1945, was a landslide victory for Clement Attlee's Labor Party.
Despite Churchill's immense personal popularity as the war leader.
Astonishing, but true. The public admired him hugely for winning the war, but they didn't trust him to win the peace, or rather, to build the kind of peace they wanted. His wife Clementine tried to console him, saying defeat might be a blessing in disguise. His reply was classic Churchill. At the moment, it seems very effectively disguised. He was utterly devastated. So, kicked out of office right at his moment of victory. But Churchill doesn't just retire. He stays on as leader of the Conservative Party, leader of the opposition.
And he finds a new enemy, or rather, refocuses on an old one. Soviet communism.
Immediately. His attention shifts fully to the emerging Cold War. And less than a year after the election defeat, in March 1946, he travels to Fulton, Missouri, in the U.S., and delivers probably his most famous post-war speech.
The Iron Curtain speech.
Exactly. He warns starkly about Soviet expansionism in Eastern Europe, declaring that an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. It's a powerful, defining image of the Cold War divide.
And in that speech, he also calls for something else significant.
Yes, he explicitly calls for a special relationship between the British Commonwealth and the United States. He sees this Anglo-American alliance as the essential bedrock for defending democracy against the Soviet threat. He's really trying to formalize and cement that wartime partnership.
He also talks about European unity around this time.
He does. He becomes quite a vocal proponent of pan-Europeanism in the late 1940s. He gives speeches calling for a United States of Europe, arguing that Franco-German reconciliation is vital for peace.
But with a catch, right, for Britain.
Always a crucial caveat. He envisioned Britain as a supporter, a sponsor, even a partner of a united Europe, but never part of it in a federal sense. Britain, in his view, had its destiny tied to the Commonwealth and the special relationship with America. Its global status was separate. Joining a European federation was unthinkable, back to that imperial mindset in a way.
He eventually gets back into power, wins the 1951 general election.
Just scrapes back in, actually. Labor won more votes overall, but the Conservatives won more seats, so he becomes prime minister again at the age of nearly 77.
And his health is starting to fail by this point.
Increasingly so. He suffers several minor strokes, and then a quite serious one in 1953, which incapacitates him for a while. Remarkably, the severity of the stroke was kept secret from the public and even most of the cabinet at the time.
So this second premiership, 1951, 1955, what are the priorities? Is it still the Cold War and the Empire?
Very much so. Foreign affairs dominate his thinking. Maintaining the Anglo-American relationship is key, trying, often vainly, to manage the decline of the British Empire. The U.S., under Eisenhower, was actually much less supportive of British imperial ambitions than Churchill hoped. They were often quietly encouraging decolonization, which frustrated him.
What about domestic policy? Any major initiatives?
Not really his focus anymore. The one area where his government did make significant progress was housing. They achieved their manifesto pledge, overseen by Harold Macmillan, of building 300,000 new houses a year, which was badly needed after the war. But social reform, economic policy, that was largely left to his ministers like Butler.
And internationally, he's dealing with challenges like Egypt and Kenya.
Yes. He reluctantly agrees to a phased withdrawal of British troops from the Suez Canal zone in Egypt in 1954, under pressure. But elsewhere, he maintains a firm imperial stance, continuing military operations against the communist insurgency and the Malayan emergency, and overseeing the often brutal response to the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, still clinging to the idea of empire.
He tried to engage with the Soviets after Stalin died.
He did. After Stalin's death in 1953, Churchill saw a potential opening, a chance for détente. He pushed for a summit meeting with the new Soviet leaders. But President Eisenhower was deeply skeptical, feeling it would just be a Soviet propaganda exercise, and essentially blocked the idea.
That must have been frustrating for Churchill.
Immensely. He felt the world was missing a crucial opportunity. He also developed a significant distrust for Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, whom he saw as rigid and confrontational. You see the U.S. and U.K. strategic views diverging more clearly in this period.
He finally retires as Prime Minister in 1955.
Yes, hands over to Anthony Eden. He accepts a knighthood from the Queen in 1953, becoming Sir Winston, and accepts the Order of the Garter, Britain's highest order of chivalry.
Didn't he turn down being made a duke?
He did. Apparently, the Queen offered to create him Duke of London, a very rare honor, but Churchill declined, supposedly because his son Randolph, who hoped to follow him into politics, wouldn't inherit the title under the rules at the time and won't be disadvantaged.
He remains an MP for several more years.
Until the 1964 general election, yes, though his appearances in Parliament become increasingly rare. A moment of recognition comes in 1963 when President Kennedy makes him an honorary citizen of the United States.
And he passes away in 1965.
January 24th, 1965, at the age of 90. He was given a magnificent state funeral, a rare honor for a non-royal, broadcast around the world. Huge crowds lined the streets of London, a testament to the enormous impact he'd had.
Beyond the politics and the wars, we need to touch on the other facets of his persona. The writer, the artist.
Absolutely. The writing is central. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1953, not for fiction, but for his historical and biographical works, his speeches, his mastery, as the citation said. And he had to use the name Winston S. Churchill on his books to avoid being confused with an American novelist of the same name.
And the painting. That was more than just a hobby.
It seems to have been deeply important to him, another way to cope with the black dog. He started painting relatively late in life, around 40, but became incredibly prolific, producing hundreds of canvases, mostly landscapes. He often painted under the pseudonym Charles Morin. He was actually quite accomplished.
He also had other, maybe more surprising interests. Bricklaying.
Yes. He took up bricklaying at his country home, Chartwell, became quite skilled at it. He even briefly joined the Amalgamated Union of Building Trade Workers, though they apparently kicked him out when he rejoined the Conservatives.
And animals. He was famously fond of animals.
Loved them. Kept numerous pets. Cats, dogs, pigs, swans, even butterflies he bred. There's that wonderful quote attributed to him. Dogs look up to you, cats look down on you, give me a pig. He looks you in the eye and treats you as an equal. Tells you something about his personality, perhaps.
Which brings us to the really complex part, his legacy. How do the sources characterize his fundamental ideology? It seems all over the place.
It's incredibly hard to pin down. Our sources describe him variously as fundamentally conservative, yet also liberal in outlook, and someone never circumscribed by party affiliation. He championed trade unions early on, delivered major social reforms, but was fiercely anti-socialist, a paternalist reformer, perhaps. But then you have the immovable object, his imperialism.
Right, this raises that huge question. How do you reconcile the wartime hero, the savior of democracy in 1940, with this lifelong, deeply ingrained belief in the British Empire?
It's the central contradiction. He held this romanticized view of empire, genuinely believing it was a force for good, maintaining the welfare of its subjects, even as history was clearly moving in the opposite direction. This belief underpins so many of his controversial actions and statements.
Including some very disturbing views on race and eugenics, even for his time.
Yes. While he was pushing liberal reforms as Home Secretary, the sources show he also supported ideas like the forced sterilization of the feeble-minded, as they were termed then. He wrote about the growth of the feeble-minded and insane classes, constituting a national and race danger. It's shocking to read now, and it shows a dark underside to his worldview, rooted in Edwardian ideas about social hierarchy and racial purity.
And his comments about non-white people, the Bengal famine context again.
He was certainly prone to derogatory remarks about various ethnicities, which were common among his class and time, but still jarring. Yet, paradoxically, he consistently opposed anti-Semitism, speaking out against it back in 1904.
But even that was complicated. Zionism versus conspiracy theories.
Exactly. He supported Zionism, the creation of a Jewish national home, but at other times, particularly when railing against communism, he echoed anti-Semitic tropes, suggesting Bolshevism was driven by an international Jewish conspiracy. It's deeply contradictory and reflects the complex, sometimes ugly, intellectual currents of his era.
So we've traced this incredible journey, From escaping that POW camp, switching parties, driving reforms, warning of war, leading a nation through its darkest hour, losing the peace, becoming an elder statesman, it's just monumental.
The sheer scope is staggering. His ability to operate at the highest level in politics, military strategy, and be a Nobel-winning writer, it's almost unparalleled. And the rhetoric, the power of his words to shape events is undeniable.
But as you said, defined by contradiction.
Absolutely. The liberal reformer whose flagship economic policy as chancellor arguably damaged the economy, the fierce imperialist who unleashes the SOE to stir up anti-imperial resistance against the Nazis, the wartime genius who couldn't grasp the public's desire for peacetime domestic reform.
So the final question for you, the listener, when you assess a figure this colossal, who are you actually judging? Is it the heroic symbol, the bulldog spirit, who defied Hitler? Or is it the man deeply committed to an ideology imperialism that history was already leaving behind?
And maybe add this to your thinking. We've mentioned the black dog several times. Churchill himself said his achievements would have been impossible without it, that the drive to escape depression fueled his immense activity. How does knowing about that lifelong struggle perhaps contextualize the sheer, relentless volume of his work, his writing, his political battles, his triumphs, and his failures? Something to mull over. Go forth and explore the layers.